Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait another minute or two for everyone to be able to come on as people are still joining. Well, with your permission, I'll begin. We know that people are still joining, but the beginning is sort of the background to this, and many people know it. Let me welcome you all to the Driving Inclusion in Clinical Research webinar series. I am Barbara Bierer, the Faculty Director of the MRCT Center, and really privileged and delighted to be hosting this panel today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you on who are calling in. And just the next slide, you can see that I always start with a disclaimer, which says that we represent our own views in this discussion, not those of the US Food and Drug Administration or any of the affiliated organizations or entities of any member who contributed to this work or any member on the panel. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions and grants, which you can read about. No one on the panel has conflicts of interest relevant to this presentation or discussion. And again, we are all speaking in our individual capacity. Could I have the next slide? So I do want to say that this is one of a series of webinars. We've done some work, which I'll introduce, in thinking about diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical trials. And after we felt that it was important to really dig into some of the aspects of how to make our clinical research ecosystem more inclusive. And therefore, over weeks, we have been really working on having webinars addressing specific issues, and both introducing it with some of the work that MRCT has contributed to, but also then inviting two or more individuals to contribute to that discussion in terms of what they've done, what the tricks of them, sort of, and successes have been, and how to make that work real with examples. So those webinars, recordings, and slides are available to download. And on the next slide, you'll see that we are planning 2 additional ones at this time, and then we'll take a break in August and resume in September. In June, we're going to be talking about inclusion of persons with disabilities in clinical research, specifically the physical disabilities of hearing, vision, and mobility, and talking through some of the issues to think through in how to make clinical trials and individuals, clinical trials inclusive, and persons with disabilities included. And in July, we're going to be talking about translation in clinical research, limited English proficiency, but more specifically translation into other languages when participants speak other languages as their first or primary language. That's a complicated equation, as you know, not only cost and delay, but also how many languages does one translate and to which participant-facing materials. So we look forward to these upcoming discussions. Today, on the next slide, we're going to be talking about inducement or fair compensation, the impact on diverse participation. And I'm really delighted to welcome Luke Gelinas, the Senior Advisor at MRCT Center, and as his day job, the Chairperson at Advarra IRB, Melissa Gonzales, the Inclusion Principal and External Partnering Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech, a Roche company. Len Lichtenfeld, who is a medical oncologist and the former Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the American Cancer Society, and Joe Liss, an associate at Ropes and Gray. And today we're going to be having, after a few minutes of introduction, a panel discussion, which we haven't done before, but is a way of really focusing on some of the critical issues in this. Now, the reason we're talking about this, obviously, is because the payment and costs for clinical trials is one of the barriers for individuals, particularly of economic disadvantage. So can I have the next slide? And just as background, for those of you who don't know, the MRCT Center is a research and policy center that is really dedicated to improving the integrity, rigor, and safety of global clinical trials, and specifically the conduct, ethics, and regulatory environment of international clinical trials. And we do the work by pulling together diverse stakeholders from across the clinical trial ecosystem to really focus on emerging issues in clinical trials, and then specifically, rather than just defining those issues and clarifying them, thinking about what practical and actionable solutions we can propose or identify that have been successful. And can I have the next slide? And that led us about 3 years ago to focus on this issue of diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research, because we were profoundly impacted by the fact that very little had changed, even though it had been a long identified problem. The FDA produced snapshots that documented that our trials are poorly representative in the United States and elsewhere. And we pulled together, after a discussion about what we could do in this space, 2 members from the FDA, Luther Clark from Merck, David Strauss from Columbia, our staff, and then importantly, about 50 different individuals from across the clinical trial enterprise to really think through what barriers are there, how can we address them, and what are those practical considerations that would really impact the difference and make a difference. We worked on this for about 2 years and then published the first, or made available, the guidance and document on our website in August of last year. And I think it resonated at a time in certainly US history where we were both impacted and are impacted by the COVID-19 disproportionate impact on individuals of color and of marginalized populations, and also the social consciousness of the injustice that has burdened our history. So I think many people are now committed to seeing what we can do in this space to make a real and prolonged difference. Could I have the next slide? And in that document, we went through a number of recommendations. We talked through how each member of the community can work to change the paradigm and the future, and how we can help each other be successful. And the toolkit does provide adaptable resources that are not found elsewhere or easily found elsewhere. And we invite you to contribute other resources as we're continuing to build this website and the tools for everyone. Could I have the next slide? So there is a website. We have new updates and a newly created website for you. Feel free to explore that. And could I have the next slide? And today we're really going to talk about payment in clinical trials. And, you know, one of the things that we're very aware of is that the costs of clinical trial participation present a barrier to enrollment. And particularly profoundly for economically disadvantaged individuals. And we start from the position that anyone participating in clinical research, whether or not there is an individual benefit, it is, you know, always for generalizable knowledge and for the benefit of society. And people should not end their participation worse off financially for having contributed to social good. So that's our presumption or supposition going into this work. But there has been a long-standing concern that if you pay somebody, even if you're just reimbursing incurred expenses, that somehow that will bias their voluntary decision-making and compete with their self-interest, modify how they approach that decision, and may represent undue inducement. Some people have said coercion. We're going to use the words undue inducement here. And, you know, supported in that, both the FDA and OHRP in the United States and SIAMS and the Declaration of Helsinki internationally talk about undue inducement, but they don't define it, nor do they forbid payment. So on the one hand, they say, be careful of it, but they don't say you can't pay in any capacity. And in SIAMS and Declaration of Helsinki and ICH, they do encourage payment. They do encourage reimbursement for expenses and compensation. So how we approach this and how we think about this is the topic today. Could I have the next slide? So we're going to talk about, and this is the SIAMS for those of you who haven't seen it, talking about monetary or non-monetary compensation and the benefits. So next slide. So we're going to talk about, you know, sort of what are the principles that help to ensure autonomy and voluntariness and preserve the individual's ability to make a value concordant decision about whether or not to participate in trials. And we found in working on this that if we just talk about payment, it's not a very helpful concept because it sort of converges a number of different kinds of payment that we are going to try to differentiate today in order to make sure that we're talking about apples to apples. So reimbursement, compensation, and incentive payments. And we're going to talk in those buckets. And I think generally there's been some acceptance to thinking about payment in this way. So we want to talk about fair payment that don't risk undue inducement. And, you know, and I'm going to go through each of those very briefly now. Could I have the next slide? So, oh, sorry. For this discussion, there's a very big assumption. And that assumption is that the IRB has reviewed and approved the protocol, that the risks have been minimized and the benefits are proportionate or outweigh the risks of participation, and that those decisions are made by the IRB in the absence of considerations of payment. So in other words, it's a viable, okay trial to approve absent any consideration of payment. And specifically, the IRB, when and PI should not consider payment a benefit. Now, of course, participants will see payment potentially as a benefit, but that's not the ethical evaluation of the protocol. Could I have the next slide? So how do we think about this in terms of payment for participation? Is it fair compensation or undue inducement? Should we be looking towards individuals who, if we don't offer payment, to depend on their altruistic nature, or is that in fact exploitation? And under what conditions does it sway one way or another? Is it a benefit, or is there also risk to payment? And we're going to explore those. Is there a differential impact on people who are economically disadvantaged? Are there unintended consequences for that payment? And can we agree on the approach? And today we're focusing on payment for participation in clinical research. We are specifically not talking about compensating patients, patient advocates, and others in the public who may contribute to product development or to the design or execution of trials in other capacities. So this is purely about participation. Could I have the next slide? So just to mention, this is a issue in all countries and also an issue of amount. So the terms we're going to use today are reimbursement, which is reimbursement for expenses. You can see on the right the kinds of expenses we're talking about: transportation, benefit, food, and incidentals such as childcare, ancillary medical expenses, and then it's not parking, but housing. Compensation, when we use that term, we're going to mean reimbursement for the time and burden of clinical trial participation. And incentive payments is when you're paying for intentionally to increase study recruitment, retention, or completion. And that is perhaps the most controversial of the kinds of payments. What is the bonus payment that is okay to give? And why? But we're not, and we know that there are non-financial benefits, doing good for society and that kind of thing, but we're not going to discuss those further. We're really going to focus on money. Could I have the next slide? So what are the risks? Certainly deception. If the money is so good and so large that people will potentially deceive about their eligibility in order to get into the trial. That's one possible risk of payment. Participant safety, where the possibility of getting a payment at the end of the trial is such that they will discount their own symptoms or potential adverse events because they want to continue to participate. And then there are some that we're going to dig into, like tax consequences and having to give TINs or social security numbers. And that, of course, is an issue for undocumented immigrants. And the tax consequences of being compensated, I think, are underappreciated. And then specifically the loss of entitlements as well. Could I have the last slide? Or I think the last line. So there are some other huge costs that we need to think about, which are the expenses for medical care and standard of care in research. It's particularly important for those underinsured and uninsured, and we're going to come back to it. Copays, even with insurance, those can be significant. And research-related injury and who pays for that, which we don't have a standard in the US. There is a question that emerged: what is loss of entitlements? We will dig into that, but it's losing, for instance, eligibility for Social Security, SSI, et cetera. Could I have the next? So with that, let me, I've introduced the panelists. You can see them here. and look forward to a robust discussion. I think what we should do, if it's okay with my panelists, is let each person begin with sort of a few-minute introduction of their perspective. So Len, maybe I could call on you since you're the first in my little Brady bunch over here.
Thanks, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be with you, and my appreciation to MRCT for inviting me to be part of this panel today. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Len Lichtenfeld, and I'm formerly Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society, currently an independent consultant based in Atlanta. And I do believe I should mention that I am an advisor to a company named Trial Trajectory, which is devoted to engaging patients and caregivers with a patient focus in participation in clinical trials. I'm also on the Board of Trustees for Cancer Care, an organization that you may be familiar with, which does provide social, emotional, and financial support for those who are in need, those with cancer who are in need. That money does come from pharmaceutical companies. However, the disbursement of that money, decision-making, is entirely within the hands of cancer care. So I want to be brief here in the interest of time, just to suggest that all of us who are here today are very familiar with the fact that participation in clinical trials is a long-standing issue. And it's become perhaps somewhat more acute, especially during COVID, as we tried to make adjustments to enable people to continue in clinical trials, let alone get new participants into those trials. It has been a long-standing personal interest, and I do feel compelled to acknowledge my colleagues at the American Cancer Society, especially Mark Flory and those at ASCO and many other organizations who have joined together, just like with MRCT, who have joined together to advance clinical trial participation and address some of the barriers. We really are in a very special time when it comes to cancer care. I will admit, as you can see from the white hair, that I've been around cancer for many decades. Clinical trial participation has always been a problem, and here we find ourselves at an incredible, over the past several years actually, incredible inflection point in cancer care, where we have made significant advances, especially in understanding the genomic pattern, the genomic targets that we discovered along with others. And we've had literally, in some reports, thousands of clinical trials that have been focused in particular areas. However, for many of those trials, the population of interest has gotten smaller and smaller as we've gotten more focused. I call it the funnel effect, where we get more concentrated. And so now we have clinical trials that may impact a very small percentage of patients with a particular type of cancer. So it becomes all the more important that we find those patients where they are. And it becomes even more important that those individuals and their families are able to participate in clinical trials. And from my perspective, finances should not be a barrier to that participation. I, until recently, lived in a rural area in South Georgia. And I think that one of the elements that this, including all the social justice awareness that has come up over the past year, and the health equity awareness, I think we need to understand that we tend to have frames of reference that we're familiar with. But many of us don't think about the large and substantial number of cancer patients that live in rural America, some of whom live great distances from cancer treatment centers, but others who live not that far away, who can't even afford gas money to get back and forth for their treatment. And that isn't also a limiting factor in the decisions they make. So for example, a woman who lives 30 miles from a cancer treatment center may opt for a mastectomy instead of local resection and radiation therapy, because they can't afford to go back and forth every day for the number of weeks at that point in time when this example came to my attention. They couldn't afford the money to go back and forth. So we're talking about issues that show up in routine care as well as some of the points that Barbara has already made. So I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that this is a very broad issue. It's not directed just to disadvantaged communities and urban centers. It's an issue, a socioeconomic issue that faces patients with cancer and the willingness to participate in clinical trials throughout the country. So in the interest of time, I'll yield the floor back to you, Barbara, and more than
Thank you, Lynn.
excited to participate in the upcoming
Thank
discussion.
you.
Thank you.
So Luke, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. So I wanted to make just a couple of regulatory and ethical points, some of which, Barbara, you've already started to make. But as Barbara said, I think it's undeniable that historically the regulatory community and IRB specifically, at least in the US, have been sort of a source of concern about payment and have probably held up payment practices. And when you stop to think about that, it's kind of interesting in itself that we worry so much about this in the regulatory community. As a society, we don't typically worry generally about paying people for doing similar things, right? Like for undertaking time-consuming, burdensome, risky endeavors. We don't worry about paying, say, people who put out fires or people who serve in the military. And in many ways, though not all, I think those are quite similar to research participation. So I think that begs the question, why do we worry about this so much in the IRB and regulatory community? And one big piece of the answer here, I think, is just that the regulators, really, it's regulatory guidance that instructs us to worry about it. I think it's also important to emphasize that regulatory guidance is somewhat permissive too. It says payment for research is generally acceptable. Important to keep that in mind. But if you're on an IRB, review the payment and make sure that it's not so high that it causes undue influence for participants. So you might be asking yourself, oh, what exactly does that mean? What does undue influence involve or look like here? And I think that's in some ways the million-dollar question. Again, it's very important to me to think about what it doesn't mean. I don't think undue influence involves just someone being motivated by a payment offer to participate in research, even if it's not something they might not have done otherwise. And the regulators are also clear on that. OHRP says that payment is an acceptable motivation to participate in research generally. What the regulators seem to be more concerned about, as I think Barbara sort of alluded to, is that payment might somehow distort decision-making, kind of getting in the way of making a good decision, cloud someone's judgment, cause them to underappreciate the risk and sort of to maybe rush headlong into research when they might be better off sort of stepping back and doing a more robust kind of risk-benefit assessment on their own. And that's sort of, it's important to keep that in mind, that this sort of involves something that distorts decision-making and undermines informed consent. Now you can ask, do offers of payment really do that? That's sort of an empirical question. How do offers of payment actually impact decision-making? And there have been a number of studies that have tried to look at this and see. And I just want to make the point that when you look at those studies, and this is a place where we need more work, what they've generally found is that offers of payment do not actually distort decision-making in this way. What they've found is that the more money you offer people, actually, the more careful and hesitant they tend to be about enrolling in research, which sort of makes sense. Research offers often happen in a medical context where people aren't used to getting paid for things. And so if you're offered a payment, if you offer payment in a context in which you're not used to getting offered payment, you might do well to stop and think about why you're being paid. So it actually seems in the few studies we have to increase caution. And so that's just to say that I guess I'm hopeful to think that sort of the foundations on which these ethical and regulatory concerns are built, I'm hopeful that it's sort of becoming more and more acknowledged that they might not be very strong, and that we can sort of move past this basic concern with just payment generally and start having more robust discussions about fair compensation and how to use payment wisely in the research context.
Thank you, Luke. That's very helpful perspective. Let me, if I could turn to Melissa.
Thank you for having me today. My name is Melissa Gonzalez. I'm here from the Chief Diversity Office at Genentech, where Quita Highsmith is our Chief Diversity Officer. We're a new department because Genentech really wanted to embed diversity and inclusion throughout the company. And so with this new department, as you can imagine, setting up during a pandemic, during all of the racial justice issues, it has been a very exciting year. And I have had a variety of roles at Genentech, but it's always been focused on clinical research, working with population health managers. And now the focus within the Chief Diversity Office is advancing inclusive research, which is our initiative to diversify clinical research. So very aligned with MRCT. Now, when we talk about advancing inclusive research, it's because Genentech is uses groundbreaking science to develop treatments for all patients, all communities. So Len, to your point, We want to make sure that we're reaching rural communities, ethnic minorities. And when it comes to diversifying clinical research, as you can imagine, helping patients have access to research is, of course, very important. So our position on this topic is Genentech is committed to recruiting and retaining patients in our trials in a manner that minimizes adverse financial impact to them. So we use a variety of different solutions. I think one of the most important is working with vendors that can provide transportation, lodging resources, and certainly oversee all of the clinical trial and reimbursement processes, such as through ClinCards. Another key aspect is, as a study sponsor, we take it very seriously and have dedicated colleagues that when clinical trials are being designed, sit down with the study teams and help them understand how to pull through all of these resources and reimbursement opportunities to make sure that patients are not being disadvantaged financially. And then, of course, we're a large global corporation. We have a variety of departments entrenched in this space. And so, for example, a lot of our corporate giving dollars go to national partners through grants that also focus in these areas about how to provide financial assistance and education to patients, because I think education is another key point around this. To Luke's earlier comment, many patients don't understand clinical research, let alone the financial impact that can be associated with clinical research.
Thank you. Thank you. So Joe, we haven't heard from you and your perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for having me on. As Barbara noted, my name is Joe Liss. I am an associate at Ropes & Gray. Obviously, from the perspective of conflicts of interest, Ropes & Gray represents entities, companies, research institutions, et cetera, who interact quite a bit with this space. I also want to note, in addition to the caveat that we're not speaking for our organizations and just offering our own opinions, that in this setting, I'm talking at a fairly high level, and so my comments shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Barbara always says that as a lawyer, I start everything with some sort of disclaimer. So there it is. But so one issue that Barbara mentioned and that came up as a question in the chat is access to entitlements. And something that's important to keep in mind as we're talking about clinical trial research compensation is that reimbursement and compensation might not necessarily track their plain meaning when it comes to the tax law. And the IRS defines, and the tax law defines income quite broadly as being from whatever source derived. And this is particularly important because for certain government programs, there are very low income eligibility thresholds. So for example, when it comes to for cash assistance that comes through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, the income threshold for phasing out that assistance in Alabama is as low as below $4,000, and in Massachusetts is below $11,000. And so even marginal increases in compensation for low-income individuals can put them at risk of losing these public benefits. And this is particularly important in the context of the gig economy, because in the gig economy, people are stacking multiple jobs on top of each other, and if they then stack clinical trial participation on top of that, that could be the thing that pushes them over the edge from an eligibility perspective. It's also worth noting, though, that this isn't just a negative story necessarily. So, for example, for very low-income individuals, the earned income tax credit can actually boost and provide a supplement to any income that they earn. And so if compensation for clinical trials were to be considered income, they could actually get a boost from that. So it's an issue that's important to keep in mind, and one that I know Barbara and others are paying attention to in this space.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me start with a sort of simple question. I've been in lots of conversations where specifically sponsors say, we don't pay participants because we don't want to induce them. And I induce or this is against sort of the culture. I wonder if that's beginning to change, number one, and number two, whether there are specific instances where we should worry that paying participants or paying parents of children or guardians of individuals or legally authorized representatives would be problematic, or where we should be concerned, and what do we do about that? Just to start with a hard one.
All right, I wonder if we want to distinguish here phase one from other types of research. Because
Yes,
in my perspective, a lot of the concerns over payment tend to arise in phase one context, where the main motivation for healthy volunteer research seems to be payment. In other types of therapeutic research, the motivation is something like, I don't really have any good therapies left. I've tried them all and nothing's working for me outside of a research context. And then for me, there's less sort of concerns in the therapeutic space about the worries you kind of flag there.
Yeah, but there are plenty of studies, particularly academic studies, that are not therapeutic, where, when I was a medical student, I used to get $170 for a bone marrow biopsy, and like that was rent. So is that a problem? That's not a phase one study, and it's so, and do we worry about LARs and guardians? Should we worry about minority participants, or more precisely and more accurately, economically disadvantaged participants? Does this become unjust inducement, not just undue inducement?
Barbara, if I may, I don't know if others have the question in their minds. When you say payment, are you referring to payment for expenses, reimbursing actual costs, or are you talking about other payments outside, such as salary replacement or a specific amount of money for participation? Because each one has a different answer, I believe.
Well, take us through that logic.
So this may sound somewhat basic and to some maybe too simple. No one gets cancer because they want to. Okay, so I think that there's a question about why. We have to ask ourselves from an ethical standpoint, why is the person in the place that they are at that particular moment? That's number one. In fact, we've had the changes in rules made at the federal level for Social Security, where people could bypass the wait period if they had certain cancer diagnoses. We worked on that a number of years ago. And that was a clear change based on a need that was very clear. For example, if you have pancreatic cancer, you weren't there because you wanted to, and we needed to help move that benefit further up. So that's test number one. Test number two is what I would call a reasonableness factor. And although Joe May and others are probably smiling when you say the reasonable man, the reasonable prudent person, there is at some point a balance between what is excessive versus what's appropriate under a circumstance. And so from my thinking and understanding where we need to be, and then of course the third element is the social good. We are, as I mentioned earlier, an inflection point. We have huge opportunities. We need to do everything we can. Some of these opportunities will involve only a small number of patients around the country. And we need to do everything we can to enable, not to induce, but to enable participation. And enabling participation means food and rent, and it means salary considerations, although not 100% necessarily. And frankly, it means not just for the patient themselves, but for caregivers. Any of you who have had someone in your family who's been ill or have had to go for a medical procedure, who you have to, it's not just me who goes to the colonoscopy. It's my wife has to figure out how she's going to adjust her schedule and get there to take care of me. So it's a bit broader than just the individual. So at some level, and I'm certainly interested in what others have to say, at some level, there's a reasonableness test that says this is appropriate versus this is inducement. We have to start with a fundamental principle. I don't think anyone sitting there listening to a clinical trial explanation and the X number of pages of informed consent because they want to be there. They're there because they have a need and an interest, and society has an incredible need and interest in making sure that people are appropriately, I will say, cared for during a period of time of having others, in a sense, even their altruistic desire to help advance science.
Thank you. Anyone else? Melissa, let me put you on the spot for a second. Do you in general worry more as a company about incentive payments? And do you see that there should be a different standard or expectation for small biotech versus big pharma, as it were? Or are these principles beyond sort of the scope and size of the company?
So I think as a study sponsor, especially at a large global company now, right? Because we're under the Roche affiliate, we have hundreds of study teams, and we do provide stipends through a lot of, so not just the reimbursement, but stipends per visit for many of our trials. And I think always saying sort of like, well, I mean, how did we end up in this space of lack of diversity in clinical research? Part of that is because across the spectrum, we are inadvertently selecting for high socioeconomic people, right? People that could afford to spend the time, pay the copays, participate in clinical research. So to say it's just not ethical to do reimbursement or stipends, that doesn't make sense, especially because we want to remove barriers to diversify clinical research. And so that, is one stance. When it comes to, small biotech versus pharma, my perspective is, of course, coming from a large pharmaceutical company. I think all people that are, in this space need to do, it's a confusing space, I guess, right? Like, as you said at the beginning, there's not a lot of clear-cut guidance. And so I think it's a lot of confusion. People have the right intention, but I think there's still a lot of interpretation and confusion where we are trying to get around it. And so in a large company, what we do is provide guidance documents, have teams. We have multiple departments running clinical trials, have teams as they're running pilots, looking for innovative ways to approach in this space, especially in the pediatric space, sharing best practices, sharing what they've learned so that we're not working in silos, but trying to figure this out together, because there's not a one size fits all solution depending on the disease area, the local venue. Fair market value in one site would be totally different compared to another site. So that's where we also have to work with the IRBs and sites to understand all of these complexities.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, if I may, that, I think that this issue of reimbursement and compensation and incentive payments are really a rounding error for the cost of clinical trials, and just that we shouldn't, that may be different in academic trials who really don't have any funding, but we're not talking about big dollars, not big dollars. Now, maybe that's incorrect in that, but I just don't see that this is an issue. But let me, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to see if I could maybe try to address your question, which I think is a really important question about at what point payment does become concerning. So to me, I think reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses and compensation for time and burden and risk undertaking, you can make the case that neither of those is really a net benefit for participants. Reimbursement, you're just getting back what you paid. Compensation, you're just being treated fairly for what you've given. It's only when we creep into that sort of incentive, the above and beyond what's sort of fair, that I think we get to these worries for me. And my own view is that if sponsors and researchers were taking serious reimbursement and compensating fairly, then there would be the payment practices, I think, would change drastically, and there might not even be a need for further incentive to increase accrual rates or try to increase accrual rates. I think we're pretty far away from fair reimbursement and compensation. If we got there, you might find that the purpose that incentives are meant to serve, increasing accrual, is being served by the compensation and reimbursement already.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that there's an argument, a principled argument that people have made that in therapeutic trials, the fact that you have access to medicines is itself a benefit that one should account for, and that it's approvable because you're giving access to medicines, even if it's exploitative or whatever, because you're not reimbursing. I feel like we should at least reimburse, and then we can worry about compensation. And you can even put further parameters on this, that it should be incremental expenses for the research, so that you're not, sort of, but those are in the details and the sort of narrow window. But I do want to allow time for Joe to further explore the issues of the negative potential consequences. And, as an institution or as a PI, what does one do about that? And is there anything that one can do locally? Do we always need to collect SSA, Social Security numbers, or taxpayer identification numbers? We have an obligation, for instance, to report at $600, and the CLIN cards have the same obligation. Immediately as a problem, we don't think about it because it's the incidental person that is impacted, not a class of people. We don't think about it generally as a consequence at the IRB. How should we approach that? Or is there a societal way of approaching it? Is there some measure that we could introduce? Because, there have been some exceptions made.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So I'm not a tax attorney. There goes the disclaimer. So I think that speaking to what individual entities or organizations should do in their own trials is probably a bit beyond the scope of what we can address here. I imagine that there are lots of things that come into play as individual organizations are setting up their own reimbursement or compensation structures. But this question of reimbursement and compensation, and as you pointed out, sort of societal approaches to it, does bring up some interesting points that I think are worth talking about. So, for example, in the Improving Access to Clinical Trials Act and then the Ensuring Access to Clinical Trials Act, Congress exempted the first $2,000 of reimbursement or compensation given, and I'm not 100% sure on how the definition distinguishes reimbursement and compensation, or if it does. But the first $2,000 for participation in certain rare disease clinical trials. And the exemption, though, only applies to the Supplemental Security Income Program and the Medicaid program. So, for example, if you're in Alabama and for a family of 3, the adult in that family loses their Medicaid coverage at $4,000 in income, if they would be able to exempt $2,000 received for participation in a clinical trial from counting up their income towards that eligibility threshold. So the question is, should we apply that approach, or should Congress apply that approach more broadly to, for example, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps? And there it might make sense. On the other hand, when you're talking about very low income individuals who are earning the earned income tax, who are getting the earned income tax credit, if those individuals could count what they're getting for clinical trials as compensation, that might be beneficial to them. Similarly, for individuals who are faced with temporary, who are getting temporary assistance for needy families and are obligated to do a certain amount of work, and certain states have also attempted to impose work requirements in the Medicaid program, those individuals might benefit from being able to count participation in a clinical trial, especially a long-term clinical trial, or a clinical trial, requiring a substantial time commitment, as work. But on the other hand, individuals who are receiving disability insurance might not want to count it as work because if they work a certain number of hours or gain a certain amount of compensation per month for working, those individuals might lose access to their disability insurance. And so there's this mishmash, excuse me, of federal government programs and incentives. And I know that as we were preparing for this conversation, you had said that in your opinion, we should just, every time there's an opportunity to benefit somebody, that's what we should do. And I know that Jerry Schatz and others who are friends of the MRCT Center are also focused on this issue and thinking about it. But that's at least one sort of societal approach we might be able to take to dealing with some of the add-on consequences. Saying all of that, the questions of gaining access to a diverse population in clinical research, those questions are, I think, probably more important. Here we're talking about an important add-on effect, but ultimately an add-on effect to the main question we're addressing.
Yeah, and just to clarify what I think, I mean, we're talking about, really low levels of income. And, as my accountant once said to me, what do you want me to do, push around crumbs? I think that we need to really try to advantage people to in order to help them sustain their sort of what they can. Yeah, and Len, to your point, nobody chooses to be in this situation. So why are we compromising other aspects because of this?
Well, I'm so you can tell I'm sitting here just waiting to jump into this, because first let me put a point on something that was said a moment ago, and I'll come back to that question. Melissa mentioned about pediatric trials. And so we have a huge need to make sure, and the pediatric oncology community has done a great job of making clinical trials available nationwide in a very effective way. And we need to be doing everything we can to support, not to induce, not to create, not whatever, to support the participation for parents to make sure that their kids get access to the care that has a huge social good and has repercussions, because Andrew Lowe wrote at MIT, a finance professor at MIT, wrote an article a couple of years ago outlining what's going to happen in pediatric clinical trials, because the cost and the efficiency and effectiveness of moving people through the trials is so much higher that it may require a triumvirate, basically, of companies like Genentech and the government and private nonprofits coming together in order to make sure we get enough advances in drug treatment. So there's a huge social negative if we don't get people and help them in clinical trials. So hats off to Genentech and other companies that I know are trying to explore the space, but it's difficult. Joe, I'm not picking on you. I know I get it. But there's a huge social need, a huge social good to advance cancer care. Go around and poll or survey the country and say, if this was a barrier to advancing a cure or a control or a treatment for cancer, that we have the opportunities to do that today. And if this is a significant barrier for patients who might otherwise participate, what would be your vote politically in order to address that? How long would you stand, and I don't mean you, Joe, I mean, a political environment. How long would they stand in the way of addressing, in good conscience and good faith and looking at their constituents, stand in the way of, as Barbara's pointed out, relatively small amounts of money to get gas to somebody to go, and not have to report it as an income issue? And the answer, I bet, would be overwhelmingly in favor of saying, we think that is really important if it addresses a social need. Maybe you need a third-party administrator. I hate to put other people in the middle. Maybe you need an adjudicator to make sure it doesn't get to be an inducement, or to provide that reasonable test I talked about earlier. But if you talk to the communities at large and said, we can move cancer care forward more quickly if we have this issue dealt with, how long do you think the body politic would stand in the way? And I would venture to say, not very long. I don't think that anybody's going to think that people are going to get rich off of participating in a clinical trial that helps perhaps them someday avoid the burden of cancer care, cancer treatment, the more effective treatment.
Right.
So, that's where I am on that.
Yeah. So there are a couple of issues in the chat and in the Q&A that I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on. One is the someone who disagrees with the characterization of phase 1 trials, and that, many of them are not normal volunteers, but individuals who have failed earlier lines of therapy for their diseases in cancer. And there, at least, there is hope and a possibility of benefit. So maybe, Luke, you want to address that in terms of how you were thinking about it?
Yeah, no, I think that the distinction that you made is probably the better one between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research. So phase 1 oncology trials are a special, case of they can be therapeutic. But I think that from my perspective, a lot of these concerns about undue inducement arise most acutely in healthy volunteer research, where it's really the main, money is the main motivation. And without it, you're not going to fill your study most likely.
Another one is about this $600 sort of threshold for reporting that we have to collect in order to see whether the cumulative over a year is 600 or above, and therefore we need to report. I do want to remind people that even under 600 individuals are supposed to report by themselves. So it's impactful, but regardless of the amount, and some people have, or some institutions and some sponsors have introduced a third-party intermediary in order to give them the money to pass to others. If it's a direct pass-through, of course, that's a problem. But if you say to the trusted intermediary, you pay what you think is reasonable, or support people who need that gift, then there is no direct relationship, and I think one avoids some of those consequences. So is that true, that you can sort of introduce a workaround without a direct linkage? And I don't think ClinCard or the equivalents do that, but those are supposed to be reimbursement, at least in large part, rather than compensation, or is that also not true? Do you know? Was that a compound question and therefore unanswerable?
Are you asking me, or?
No, Melissa, in terms of the ClinCard, do you put compensation as well as reimbursement on the ClinCard?
Greenfire and other vendors like that are truly the experts in this space, Barbara. So
Okay.
that I don't have a clear answer, but
We
I
will
think
park that.
I think it highlights
agree.
though the confusion that we've been talking about that is out there. And so I want to double down on what Len said, is that it's going to require collaboration. We know there's systemic issues. We know there are sponsor issues that, we are working, diligently at, but then there's also patient level barriers. So it's also important to make sure that we're educating the patients. If we're confused about this, can you imagine a patient sitting there trying to go through a stack of papers, informed consent, with a complex trial, and then also understand the financial implications of this? It's very daunting for everybody involved. And so we want to do, everything we can, not only to financially help these patients be able to participate, but to understand it as well.
And I couldn't agree more. I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that often it is other costs than reimbursement or compensation that prevents participation. That's copays, the medical care costs of standard of care, the hospitalization. Even if you get the device for free, you're not getting, or the implant for free, you're not getting the hospitalization. All of those things are really challenging for people. And then, of course, there's the whole research-related injury which is a concern for those people who don't have insurance particularly. So
Barbara, can I enter into the discussion, the question you asked Melissa, if you don't mind, because I mentioned earlier that I'm on the board for cancer care. I do not speak for cancer care, but what the question you raised about an intermediary organization, I think is a critical one, because my understanding is that having an intermediary organization does in fact mitigate some of those reporting requirements. But for that to function, the money comes to the intermediary, but is dispensed agnostically. So company A, B, and C may contribute to a fund, but that fund can't be directly linked to participation in the clinical trial of company A, B, and C. It has to be generic. So there are workarounds. And again, coming back to the issue, I think there would be, I think we can get workarounds. You know, we can make the decisions, and I think that would remove this issue about reporting income for social good, for participating in social
I
good.
think we need to take both approaches. We need to take payment in this regard off the table as a barrier and create mechanisms that we can to allow reimbursement. And yes, it's a fair amount of work to introduce that through an organization and all the practice, but we need to figure out how to do that. We also need to advocate for systemic change to take away these kinds of, you know, unintended consequences at a time when we're trying to, you know, advance medical care and public health. So I realize we're out of time. If anyone has an important last word, feel free. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for just a wonderfully dynamic conversation. I have to say there have been the chat and Q&A has been sort of popping along. We'll do our best to respond to the folks for whom we have information and questions, and either post FAQs about this or at least give some additional references and ideas on the website, and invite you all to email us MRCT at MRCT Center at bwh.harvard.edu, and we'll try to answer your questions offline. And thank you again, Len, Melissa, Luke, and Joe for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you.